So good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming. It's late, it's also late December, but I'm very glad that we can discuss post-socialism for a change. I work more in the realm of socialism and the way it shaped the experience of the 20th century, but of course, post-socialism is no less relevant for these discussions. And I'm very glad to be here. And with Miriam, we have such a long, amazing history of different intersections and collaborations, although at first sight, it does not seem that we work on very related topics, but there were actually many times we were brought together in different ways. And today somehow I thought that the best would be maybe to just give a very broad overview and point out to certain aspects of post-socialism as as a site of knowledge production, as experience, as political moment, as everyday reality, just to get some ideas around that, and then I hope in the last part we will open discussion to see in which ways these insights speak to what are your concerns within the projects on the agency. Yeah. So I'll start maybe with simply some kind of very okay. I don't know how. Okay. Okay,
yeah.
Okay. Some very much working definition, but it somehow encompasses what I just said, that it's important to think about particular economic, everyday political patterns that define life of citizens of the state that used to have the socialist political system of the 20th century. I will share my PowerPoint with you. Also, just to know, I also made some references in the last slides, which may be useful for you at some point. So you actually also have it even here.
This is for social media.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. No, I don't mind. It's actually an experience of socialism, which is essential to think of post-socialism as such. And in academic literature, in discussions, we also encounter the term post-communism, and we can say that there is a difference in the sense that post-communism will mostly be used by political science academics and people who think of socialism or communism in terms of political system, political structure, and the effects of that political system, while post-socialism is much more used for like in humanities, social sciences, when people basically try to address aspects of lived experience of socialism in the first place, but also socialism as a political idea and its working both in the second part of the 20th century and today. So socialism as a political project, real socialism, as we tend to say, more or less failed or ended with the end of the 20th century or a little bit before that, with the dismantling of the Berlin Wall. And in this lens, it coincided with very catastrophic ethnic violence in which socialist Yugoslavia disintegrated. So we are talking about it 30 years later, and one of the legitimate questions, will I be able to handle this PowerPoint? Yes. One of the legitimate questions would be, does it make sense to speak of socialism at all now, after 3 decades of something and huge changes? but also very different paths and different changes happening in different parts of the world where socialism used to exist as a political system as such. So immediately after the end of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of Cold War, Fukuyama spoke about the end of history, so a kind of moment in which the world became united, free, so there is no need anymore for any kind of ideological disputes in the sense of speaking of two or more camps, ideologically, politically, economically, and in that sense, socialism or what's left of it does not really figure anymore as a relevant concept. Fukuyama recently, revised his views and in a way said, I was wrong. We are far from any end of history in the sense that we are living in a free world in which ideological differences do not matter anymore. But it's the fact that, again, one of the other narrative is that we are living in post-ideological world in which these clear positions do not really make much sense, because the world is united by market economy, and economic interests are all that matter, and sticking to Marx, Lenin, or other theories of socialism and communism is a kind of a privilege of people who do not really care about their existence, basically. Others are part of this global economy, and that's what really matters. Then there are global hierarchies of exclusion, extraction, and distribution, which do not care much about whether some country used to be socialist or not in the past. This logic of the way how capitalism today works actually more or less disregards these ideological differences from the past. So that would be another reason why speaking much of post-socialism does not make sense. And Dacia Janowska says that after, she's a scholar, anthropologist of Baltic states and Soviet Union, and she says that we are basically already in an era in which we should talk about, in an era after post-socialism, in which we can not only speak about how people remember socialism, but how we remember the period which can be delimited as post-socialist. So there are, of course, different views. I think relevant is what Zsuzsa Gile says, that we should not think of the period of Cold War where real socialism existed in part of the world as as time when like two different blocks were totally separate. There were so many interactions and there were so many connections between the former Second World War and the First and the Third World actually, and these like ideological elements, these different camps within global politics were mutually constitutive. We couldn't be able to speak of the Second World, in which kind of Yugoslavia would subscribe itself if there were no First World countries and Third World countries. So also in Gile's argument, post-socialism is firmly placed in this new global context. So we cannot speak of post-socialism as something which is discretely connected and rooted exclusively in societies that have an experience of state socialism in the past. That's something which matters equally in other parts of the world. So I have here a kind of critique of post-socialism, like the argument by Martin Müller that post-socialism is like pretty useless concept, especially when we think of production of knowledge, conceptual history, and so on. that it couldn't leave any lasting imprint on global social and cultural theory, as opposed to post-colonialism. We are all witnessing right now how post-colonial theory is relevant and increasingly more and more present in practically every debate in the humanities and social sciences, then the question of agency and academic voice that actually scholars coming from post-socialist societies usually do not look favorably into production of knowledge about post-socialism on the global academic arena. They don't really have much agency in shaping it. It's simply also something not seen as very relevant. Miriam just mentioned that my book will come with Duke University Press. And at some point in my negotiations for the publications, I faced that argument. It's perfect manuscript, it's so interesting and engaging, but you know Eastern European books don't sell. So somehow we are not interesting to anyone like beyond the line, like we are relevant for global production of academic knowledge only as long as we produce knowledge about ourselves as an information for the others. And this is this famous concept of area studies. So in the US, you have scholars of, I don't know, Bosnia who are predictably Bosnian, and they will be heard only when they speak about Bosnia and provide information about Bosnia to others. Speaking in universal terms is very difficult and challenging. So this is kind of critique, and that again, that's a kind of a past-facing concept. Speaking of post-socialism relates to socialism, which is more or less the past, and even post-socialism is not anymore so relevant. So generally, it's not a position from which important and relevant discourse, which is either universal or related to the future, can be articulated. Yes, uneven power relationship with knowledge production, I already mentioned. So Miller says it's time to say farewell to post-socialism and start to think what comes next. So we have this Catherine Verdery wrote this famous book at some point, What was Socialism and What Comes Next? So this is also kind of a very characteristic and peculiar imagination of a constant change and kind of a very idea of a linear sequences of events and developments, that something else should come next and that should be either better or whatever, but somehow. And of course, very important issue, here we spoke most about the production of knowledge, but very important issue is actually how this really relates to people's experience, both in socialism and in post-socialism and today, however we want to label the present moment. There are, of course, different voices opposing that uselessness of post-socialism as a concept in production of knowledge. There are many scholars who claim, and they would predictably be from this, this camp of basically people very related to societies that experience socialism and coming from these societies in one way or another. So there is a increasing claim that post-socialism should be understood as a problem space of historical and political consciousness. So from this problem space, we should be able to speak of, broader, more universally relevant issues. And even more importantly, use own experience and own knowledge to speak about the present and future. And socialism as a source of knowledge is, in that sense, one of important points. And it's not only, salon academic debate. These elements also occur in different realms. One of these moments were like these disastrous floods that happened in Bosnia, Herzegovina, Serbia, Croatia in 2012. And like the scale was really huge and very disastrous, and people were faced with very, incapable, not responding states. They faced the fact that most of the infrastructures were, left abandoned, left to decay, and not really functioning. So people, basically ordinary people, were left to their own means, their own solidarity, mutual help, using our own resources. So this is a photo of members of Speleological Society of Serbia who went to the city of Mladenovac to help. And there were many other images from that time circulating, people collecting humanitarian help, sending it to the affected areas, and trying to help in all possible ways. And at the same time, in social media, in many places, there was a public discussion, for instance, that it's necessary to bring back all these subjects from school we usually laugh about, like how it's called, opšte narodna odbrana I društvena samozaštita. Like the idea that the citizens need to be capable to respond, to also connected, part of the infrastructure for mutual help and solidarity, and not only, passive recipients of it when the time comes, because it's obviously very often not coming at all. Solidarity across borders was also very much emphasized as something, simply the story about how it was in socialism, and we need to bring back these subjects. We need to bring back voluntary labor that was really constitutive of Yugoslav socialism. These stories were very present there. Also in times of protest happening, for instance, in Bosnia and Herzegovina several years ago, in the first protests after many years in which protests were only ethnically framed, there were protests happened which kind of addressed citizenship rights. That first happened when, due to differences between different entities in Bosnia and Herzegovina and some administrative, hustle going on there, several babies, newborns, couldn't get ID number, the number necessary to have health insurance. And some of these babies urgently needed treatment abroad, and they couldn't go abroad because they didn't have this number. They couldn't get any passport. So in a way, this moment, it became very obvious. Is this a problem? Petra, do you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you, but I cannot see you, but I see the presentation.
Okay.
I can see you now.
Great. So basically, that was maybe the moment when this really very problematic, very politically crippling ethnopolitics on which Bosnia as a state was established became kind of really publicly criticized by people from all parts of the country. But then later also there were big protests, maybe you will remember that, when they burned the archives in Sarajevo. And in this moment they invented something they called plenums, and really went back to this vocabulary and imagination of collective acting that was characteristic of socialism. So in that sense, that's another way to think of post-socialism. That's the time in which what we knew, what we learned, what we practiced, how we lived in socialism is a viable source of knowledge and also something that enables agency. But it seems that it's not a very popular view. It's definitely a very unpopular view among politicians, particularly for them, socialism is over. And very symptomatically, that sentence, "we don't live in socialism anymore," appears each time when some people, some workers demand their basic rights. Then we don't live in socialism, so these are foreign companies that they don't allow you to go to toilet. We cannot do anything about it. I'll be back to these issues a bit later. So these are kind of, so this is basically, I'm of course very interested in this impossibility to claim knowledge, experience, relations, kind of agency people had. And many of these people still are around and have their own experience and memory of having it. But we live more or less in the reality in which claiming anything based on that knowledge or experience is impossible. So I'll today basically try to map this impossibility and speak about it through concepts of time, space, and infrastructure. And essentially, I'll speak about agency. That's most important concept in your own project. You are interested in the agency of the dead. I'm interested in the agency of the dead system, but even more, I'm even more interested in the agency of citizens and possibility of perceiving one as an agent within society. And I think, and that's something I really, in my work, I did a lot about post-socialist nostalgia and similar concepts and affective relationship with socialism. That's always my main argument. It's not about, only having fun or being emotionally attached from some objects or memories of your past. It's actually point out to this agency which is impossible to claim anymore today. But we'll go back to that. I didn't show you the slide, which basically, yeah, I'm trying to work on two computers, which is not a good idea, sorry. But yeah, I have some illustrations for what I was saying. So this is Serbian President Vučić, and this Jura is this Korean factory in southern Serbia, became notoriously known because they first forbade workers to go to toilet. They had to have diapers. And then during COVID, people were forced to work there despite of really, really disastrous consequences and death rate in Serbia in early months, basically the first 2 years of COVID. And then an economist from Croatia who says we are not in socialism anymore. If citizens think everything is expensive, they can go abroad and do shopping if they want. So I wanted to show you that this is really, we are not in socialism anymore, is actually pretty recurring statement you can find in media texts. And yeah, so this is kind of what I'll try to do in the rest of my talk today. And I'll start with time. So as I said, post-socialism is socialism is a constitutive part of post-socialism because it's basically what defines it. We generally, when we think about how we approach socialism or what are important really and memory practices and memory studies generally would be probably on the first place. It's maybe important to also say that, as I totally agree with Zsuzsa Gile that we should actually think of global post-socialism, it's also important to think of global political present in the sense that it's not only socialism ended in Eastern Europe and maybe some other countries of the third world, right? But something else ended with the Cold War, and that's the possibility to really, imagine, imagine the future, to think about, to think in utopian terms of the future. That was something possible globally in the second half of the 20th century, although paradoxically that was the time when there was this looming fear and danger of nuclear disaster and conflict between the two blocs. But somehow, again, paradoxically today, when we live in a nice, right world, not only all these fears are equally here and very palpable, but essentially, if we try to think about the future, it's more dystopian than utopian. So actually, that's something which also pretty much reflects why maybe also dealing with socialism becomes important, and why it's important more globally. Another issue is, of course, pretty much revisionist approach towards the history of the second half of the 20th century within former socialist societies themselves and their political and academic elites. And also nostalgia is one of the important topics that somehow occurs when we think of post-socialist studies and as such. What defines all of this, but even more experience and sensibilities of citizens, of people who live in post-socialist reality in a way, is this sense of loss, pastness, and defeat. Socialism is a defeated political system, something that failed. We can now discuss whether it failed because it was bound to fail because it couldn't survive, or there were many other aspects from which it had to fail. But this idea of failure pretty much shapes how we look back and see socialism, both as political system and historical experience. David Scott wrote a beautiful book, several beautiful books, but one which is, I think, very relevant also for us here. That's a book called Omens of Adversity, in which he speaks about socialist revolution that happened in the Caribbean, in the very small island of Grenada in the Caribbean Sea in 1979, and socialism there lasted only for 4 years, and like in many other places, ended in a violent, bloody conflict with killed people, and followed immediately with American invasion, basically, of the island. And I think it's a very kind of instructive writing for us here, because it speaks more or less of the same issues that are relevant in post-socialist Europe, but from a very different perspective, and from a very different conjunction in which actually socialism was seen as a kind of way to be a legitimate political collective subject after colonialism, something we don't have here as such. So I think this book is very, very important. But he also writes about this kind of global post-socialist condition in which actually with the end of the Cold War we got a situation in which morally and legally, basically, liberal democracy is the only possibility. So, and not only possibility, but a possibility exempt of moral and legal responsibility. So when American soldiers come to Bosnia, they have immunity in relation to local courts and courts in general. They are not equally subject of any processing in a way anyone else would be. So this is where this kind of legal exemption and exceptionality of people who embody Western liberal democracy is very, very visible. Another moment of which Scott writes is transitional justice, which in a way that's also symptomatic that it appears more or less with the end of the Cold War, and very often except from like having this, of course, morally very important idea that perpetrators are both brought to justice, and through justice whole communities and societies kind of move forward to democracy and normal life. But actually, very important part of traditional justice is what I just said, that some people are exempt from the mechanisms of traditional justice as such. And on the other hand, transitional justice, when it comes to post-socialist and some other post-colonial countries as well, does not address only concrete perpetrators who did certain crimes, but whole societies. There is this idea that there is some normative path societies need to go to change themselves, to transform themselves, to become themselves legitimate Western liberal collective subjects. Yeah. So these are kind of, this is less relevant both for you and for what I want to tell you today here, but I think it's important. That's a kind of a political framework in which post-socialism lives its lives, and it's not irrelevant for the experience of citizens of post-socialist societies as well. Another important moment here is, of course, as I said, when we speak about revisionism, historical revisionism, which mostly addresses the events of the Second World War and its aftermath. This paradigm of totalitarianism is very present and very relevant. So in 2008, we had Prague Declaration of European Conscience and Communism signed by Czech Parliament, but that also became a declaration signed within the European Parliament later, which also chose 23rd August as the European Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Totalitarian Regimes. So what these political interventions in memory, landscape, and in political culture mean, they actually imply that socialism more or less is equates with Nazism. And also, although in original texts it's somehow limited to Stalinism and time until 53, it very easily applies to all socialisms or all real socialisms in Europe. All of this, of course, has to do a lot with the question of what possibilities of agency for citizens remain in this political landscape in which their own experience of the 50 or 40 years of living in socialism is now neglected, approached only from this top-down perspective as, you know, totalitarian, and they are seen, and there are many fascinating debates about it, more or less as very kind of lacking agency in the sense that they weren't able to decide about anything. Everything was decided by the party and some power structures and just disseminated. For instance, very, very exciting and important debate related to this was a debate between feminists they were Western feminists who simply think that we cannot speak of feminism in state socialism because there was no individual agency. And of course, there is a very strong pushback of scholars of state socialism who absolutely show very persuasively that, of course, there was a possibility of that agency. And ethnographically speaking, and that's something I was getting very often because I did quite some field work, mostly in, you know, industrial sites in former industrial cities, places where industry and industrial labor was very important for communities and everyday life. And in what is kind of general trope, what we hear from people is that they had essentially much more agency then than they have today. Not only they lived better and more secure, that's how usually this is interpreted because someone else took care, but they could influence the direction in which their own lives goes, but also collective lives goes much more than today. So this is something I think that relates to the issues you will be in this project you will encounter during the fieldwork, because I think there is an important connection between how we where we see agency and when our own agency is something we cannot really claim or we don't feel we really essentially have or have only in very limited social spaces. So here I have some kind of ja, super bi bilo da nekaj odprem. Lahko jaz odprem tle, meni bo kar pasal. Povejte, če vam bo premrzlo. Jaz sem ženska v teh letih. So first, when socialism ended, first everyone was excited about opening files of secret police and finding files of yourself, your relatives, learning how you, was surveilled all the time, or someone it was a lot about control, surveillance, and dealing with this legacy of surveilling states. But then again, at some point, the focus shifted to kind of seemingly apolitical revivals of social, cultural, and everyday experiences of socialism. A lot about nostalgia here, but essentially it's kind of very individual experience and very apolitical experience. So as Gal Kiran says in one text, it's basically the main message of all this enterprise of academic work often was, yes, also in socialism, people were able to live normal lives. They have some normal life, but that's the end. They could not be seen as political subjects as such, and as social subjects, possessing certain agency. And yes, I already mentioned nostalgia a couple of times, and this is something really recurring and coming back, and we already think it's 30 years past, maybe the paradigm will shift, but it never shifts. It's all about some strange people still, celebrating some irrelevant holidays that are obsolete for 30 years already, dressing in a funny way with uniforms and marking the dictators' birthdays and so on. So this was just about Yugoslavia from the last year. And I have several more. I'll just go quickly through that because I think you can imagine what kind of discourses this is. In the beginning, it was very politically understood as Tanja was seen as something which kind of threatens, imagined development of these countries and their approaching like this norm of liberal democracies I was already mentioning. So you can see it was in the early 2000s. I don't think it's a very important discourse today. Meanwhile, nostalgia got reduced to everything which is available, concrete, then banal. In a sense, we only speak about chocolates we used to eat, music we used to listen, and so on. Kind of banalizing also these elements because they are not banal as such. It's very interesting, there is an increasing attention to object and effective potential of objects in anthropology today. There is huge kind of hype around affect and politicality of emotions in modern anthropology and related disciplines. But when it comes to Yugoslav socialism or socialism in general, somehow it's all wrong and something to dismiss. Like nostalgia cannot be political. That's maybe what is the most present today. Today, it's not so much about that nostalgia will threaten these systems. These systems are very, you could see election results from Serbia yesterday. There's no nostalgia can threaten these systems anymore. But I think the debate shifted pretty much again. That's from what I started to the actual, viability and legitimacy of terms such as nostalgia itself. So increasingly scholars, but also activists, selected politicians dismiss nostalgia as something threatening, not anymore to democracies as such, but to leftist politics and possibilities of leftist politics. That's what you will find today as very important. Here I will very shortly tell you a couple of words about what Europe has to do with that. I did a lot of research about it and tried to claim that what's happening in post-socialist societies in Europe is not something lateral or despite of their incorporation within both European Union and a system of European values or whatever predominant discourses are, but it's constituted of the economies, of practices, of hierarchies, and so on. So Budenrow, Boris Buden, very important one, which was also translated to Slovenian, Zona Prehoda, where he, for an earlier period, very clearly shows how actually collectively and individually post-socialist subjects are approached as children, as someone who needs to be governed, taught, whose reality needs to be restarted from the scratches in order for them to be part of a community of European nations. Yeah, I'll go back to that, especially in the terms, in the relation to the economic relations now, when I try to say something about place. The present and the future is very important when we think how post-socialism lives space and structuring between the past, present, and the future. But it's also very, of course, important where these things are happening. So politically speaking, geographically to a certain extent as well, we mostly speak about